Hey, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's evening here in Costa Rica. I know it's morning in other parts of the world. I want to warmly welcome you and send greetings from Costa Rica, the Earth Charter International, and our education center that is located here on the campus of the University for Peace. We are organizing this webinar as part of our UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development that we co-host together with the University for Peace. But we are also joining forces with Okayama University with their UNESCO chair in research and education for sustainable development, and Griffith University Climate Action Beacon. And I'm very happy that we were able to bring together three main speakers, but I also want to welcome all of you who are joining us today. I can see some familiar faces and friends. We are recording it, and of course, it's going to be available in YouTube, this conversation. So today's Earth Day, and it's been 52 years. So since 1970, that Earth Day is being celebrated as a day that invites us to reflect, I think, about ourselves and our relationship with our home, Earth, and maybe how much we are contributing or not with the well-being of our home and all the living beings living in our home that we share, this common home. So we thought of organizing a space to reflect and share, dialogue, exchange views on this notion of planetary well-being, but planetary well-being in a time of global crisis. We have so many different crises depending on the context where we are, but we have planetary crisis. But we would like to have this exchange through the lenses of the Earth Charter. And for that, we have invited Brendan Mackey, who is director of Griffith Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University, but he's also a member of the Earth Charter International Council. And Brendan has been involved with the Earth Charter since 1997, but he was also a member of the IUCN Council for several years. But Brendan has also been quite involved with the IPCC report. So thank you for joining us, Brendan, today. And I'm also happy to present to you Mr. Kazoo Takahashi, who is joining us from Tokyo, Japan. Mr. Kazu is a former official of OECD and advisor of the Library of Alexandria and former professor of the International Christian University. But Mr. Kazoo Takahashi is also part of an Earth Charter study group in Japan that have been working in considering and reflecting on the Earth Charter for several years. And we are also happy to welcome Anupan Saraf, who is joining us today from India, Pune. Anupan is board member, advisor to the Balaton Group, also the Club of Rome Indian National Association, and J.B. Radati. But Anupan is also professor and director of research project at the Earth Charter International. So thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us today, but I also want to thank everybody who is joining us here in Zoom or in YouTube. So I would like to start by inviting each of our dear speakers to share some reflections. If you can offer us a brief reflection on the main theme that brings us together today, which is planetary well-being in time of global crisis. May I ask Brendan to start?
Yes, thanks, Miriam, and good morning, everyone. So in response to this first question, I think it's obvious to all of us here that we face today a set of global crises that are deeply coupled. Climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, pandemic, and war. And not just in the Ukraine, but in other in other parts of our world as well. And our very planetary life support systems are being unraveled and degraded before us, and we stand on the edge of runaway climate change, mass species extinctions, and some would either also suggest now the threat of World War III. And we also live in a world where there's too many people who are denied the basic needs for a healthy and safe life, and at the same time, there are a privileged few, probably including myself, who appropriate at the expense of those with too little a unfair proportion of Earth's bounty and ecological capacity. And I think it's really critical when we're thinking about planetary well-being to understand that these global crises are deeply coupled because they share underlying causes and they impact and amplify each other. Using fossil fuel for energy is a major source of geopolitical conflict and a factor in war between nations. And of course, the emissions are the major driver of human-influenced climate change. And we also know that deforestation and degradation is the major cause for the loss of biodiversity, a major source of CO2 emissions driving global warming. And it also increases the likelihood of the spillover of pathogens from wildlife to humans and their livestock, leading to pandemics. So ironically, we also live in a time of unprecedented connectedness, information sharing, and knowledge generation. But data, information, and knowledge are of little use to improving planetary well-being in the absence of the wisdom that comes from human action informed by ethics, that is, the mindful consideration of what is the right or wrong thing to do in a given situation, and guided by ethical principles that give direction as to what constitutes right behaviours in different contexts. So too much of our decision-making, especially by our governments and the private sector, are informed by short-term, narrowly defined vested interests and self-interest. Consequently, planetary well-being suffers due to the long-term consequences and aggregated impacts of this short-term thinking. This issue is actually addressed in the Earth Charter. If you look at Principle 6C, it states, ensure that decision-making addresses the cumulative, long-term, indirect, long-distance and global consequences of human activities. To follow this principle, which is critical to achieve planetary well-being, requires an ethical commitment to the well-being of all people, including those in other countries, future generations, and the greater community of life with whom we share Earth as home. So for me, underlying our planetary crises and fundamental to planetary well-being is the ethical perspective. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you. May I ask Mr. Kazoo Takahashi, what is your reflection or general reflection on the main theme that brings us together today on planetary well-being in time of global crisis? So you're just unmute the microphone.
Release the, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think we are at a very important juncture in the history. I would like to put emphasis on the civilizational change, which characterizes our period of time. Historically, the combination of pandemic and a war has always brought about civilizational change. Just to remind ourselves of this important factor from a few of the examples. In the 5th century BC, in the middle of the Peloponnesian War between the Athens and Sparta, the epidemic in the Athens killed its leader, resulting in the victory of Sparta. And this particular situation finished the classic Greek culture with the death of the city-state system and the death of the classic Greek civilization, leading to the period eventually of the empires. Now, jumping just about 1,000 years in the 14th century, the combination of the 100 Years' War between France and England with the pandemic at that time brought about the end of the feudal age in Europe, leading us to the period of Renaissance. And jumping very close to us at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of World War I, the Spanish flu killed more people than the war itself, destroying the spirit of Europeans, leading the world community, eventually leading from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana. Therefore, historically, almost always the combination between a pandemic and a war has brought about a civilizational change. Now, right now, the combination of the corona pandemic and the Putin's war has been bringing about a rather fundamental change in the world community. And in addition to this particular combination, which has been extremely important historically, we are also faced with the environmental challenge led by the climate change. To me, we are in the threshold of a global civilizational change, leading from the first generation of a global civilization characterized by European origins to a second generation of the global civilization. And in order to navigate this turbulent period of the civilizational change, the world community has practically only one document on which we could address ourselves to this fundamental change which we are going through. This is the Earth Charter. And I think the new project of the indexation of Earth Charter will provide us a navigational charter for the world community to go through this very risky period in history, the period of civilizational change. And we need a very high quality navigational charter. And I think this is the challenge of the indexation of the Earth Charter. That's how I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anupan Sarap. What are your thoughts on planetary well-being in time of global crisis?
Well, first, let me thank Kazu and Brendan for giving an excellent overview of why planetary well-being is so important in our time, and putting it in the context of the evolution of civilization, of the way in which we as humans have been occupying ourselves or calling this planet our home. I would like to invite you to do a little bit of a thought experiment. And I'm going to move away from thinking about the planet for a moment. And I want you to think about our well-being as an individual, as a human being. So when we think about our well-being, think about the parts that make up a human person: our brain, our heart, our lungs, our liver, our kidneys. All of them together are responsible to ensure that we have our well-being. And perhaps it is during this time of pandemic that we actually realize the importance of our well-being enormously. And I think over the last 2 years, we have been so occupied with our well-being that we really recognize that it is extremely important to ensure our well-being. So in this thought experiment, I want you to imagine that your brain says that it is more intelligent than all the other parts of our body. And therefore, it claims more resources, and it claims more importance and wants to be a superpower in our body. And when that happens, it starts claiming all the resources that it wants away from the other parts. And if that would happen, then obviously, as you all would say, our well-being would suffer. So it's not so much about what resources you give to the brain. It's not so much about what resources each part can claim and which part is more intelligent, or which part is going to be able to claim itself as being a superpower or a super intelligent part of the whole. But it's really about the relationship between the parts and how the parts can interact with each other. So the well-being of the body depends on how well the brain and the heart and the liver and the lungs can interact with each other without claiming the power over the other, and ensuring that they can continue to interact to keep the well-being of the body. And if the body is well, each of the parts will be well. So if we go back to 50 years, we are in the 50 years from the time that we study on how humans have set up a growth engine in order to increase the resources available to humans, was published by the Club of Rome through the research done by the MIT team led by Professor Forrester, along with Dennis and Donella Meadows and many others. And this study actually pointed out that we are on an overshoot trajectory, and we are claiming all the resources in order to ensure that we become super dominant over other life forms and other species on this planet. Somewhere, I think, over these 50 years and perhaps even a longer period of time, we have forgotten that we are one of the species which lives on the planet, and that we really are a part, just like our brain and our heart and our lungs are a part of us. We are a part of the many different plants and animals that live on this planet Earth. And together, our interactions result in the well-being of the planet. Again, a little over 50 years ago, the independent Scottish scientist James Lovelock came up with the idea of the planet being alive through his Gaia hypothesis, and really pointed out, perhaps for the first time, that all beings on the planet work together to keep the planet habitable. So it is not about extracting resources in order to make the human population grow, but it's really ensuring that the planet is alive and well is important, so that all beings on the planet can actually thrive and the planet can be well. So just as we cannot focus our attention on just one of the parts of our body, we need to ensure that we cannot focus our attention on only one species, but rather on the relationship between the parts. And when we talk about the relationship between parts, the key issue that drives relationships is that of ethics. And when we talk about ethics, which drives the relationship between the parts, it is the Earth Charter, or the principles and the values that the Earth Charter has brought to us, that help us to think about what are the relationships that should exist between the parts of the whole. And I think as we go along, we'll talk a little bit more about them. But I think this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's good to hear your initial thoughts on how can we connect planetary well-being in time of global crisis. Now I'm gonna go back and ask, maybe let me start with Kazoo, maybe now, if possible. I'm gonna bring these two questions in one. And the question is, what is planetary well-being from your perspective? And what could be our contributions to planetary well-being? And if you can offer some examples, that'd be great. So Kazoo. Let me just open the mic.
My microphone was mute. Sorry about that. Thank you, Miriam. I think it's extremely important to reflect on a major document such as the Earth Charter from a historical perspective constantly. This has been the perspective from which contributions of such other major documents as the United Nations Charter, the Declaration on Human Rights, and so forth, have been regarded by the world community. And I think historically, the major lessons we have been learning just now are 2 points with regard to the Earth Charter. One is that out of the 4 pillars described by the Earth Charter, the 4th pillar, democracy, nonviolence, and peace, is really much more important than we thought initially. The other three are very important, all of which we recognize. But reflecting on the recent 20 years, we are forced to recognize that we have entered into a bumpy period in history. We are constantly faced with crisis, large crisis, mini crisis, local crisis, global crisis, and so forth. And the important contribution which the Earth Charter will provide will have to be to put emphasis on the crisis aspects, constant crisis, which would remind us of the importance of such a concept as resilience, which we have been talked about, related mainly to such crises as in the case of the Pan-Pacific area, and the typhoons and other natural crises, but more broadly, resilience of societies has to be clearly put at the center of our exercise of the Earth Charter. Mm. And second is to elaborate the fourth pillar of democracy, nonviolence, and peace much more. And this is the same as the chapter 16 of SDGs, which mentions these elements, but in a very awkward way. And I think peace has to be put very much at the center of the whole exercise.
Sure.
And I think these two points, one being the importance of resilience, second being the importance of the fourth pillar of the Earth Charter, these will have to be the starting point of our exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. And when we look at the fourth pillar of the Earth Charter in Principle 16, the notion of peace is really an amplified or expanded notion of peace that is not limited to peace among humans, but peace between ourselves. I mean, the right relationship of ourselves with the large living world, with other species too. Thank you, Kazu. So Anupan, I in this second question, I think you already answered in your first intervention. You already talked about what you think is planetary well-being, but the second question, you could expand a little bit more on that if you want, but the question is, what is planetary well-being from your perspective? And you stressed that has a lot to do with the interactions of all the different parts in the whole. But what is planetary well-being, and what are or what could be our contributions to planetary well-being? And if you have any example.
So as I pointed out, planetary well-being has to do with relationship between the parts and not so much to the individual parts themselves. So if we were to ask what are the qualities of this relationship that are important in order to ensure the well-being of the planet, I could talk about 4 key attributes or 4 key important things that we need to ensure in order to have relationships that would lead to planetary well-being. So the first thing I would say is that if there is no respect and care of the parts to each other, there obviously cannot be well-being there cannot be planetary well-being, which is possible, because to ensure planetary well-being and relationships which result in planetary well-being, you have to have respect and care for the parts that make up the planet. The second part is, I would say, is that we need to ensure that the relationship or the relationships that make up the planet need to be allowed to evolve on their own, rather than be directed by a species or a group of people. So when that starts happening, the relationship suffers and it breaks down, and you cannot ensure planetary well-being. When you allow for the relationships to evolve, you ensure the ecological integrity of the relationships, because all the relationships that exist in the planet form an ecosystem, and to ensure that this is going to evolve in a natural way rather than be directed by the dominant species to go in a particular way, then obviously we cannot ensure planetary well-being. The third attribute I would say about relationships for planetary well-being is that of the well-being of the individuals who make up, or the species, the parts which make up the whole. So unless the parts, the well-being of the parts is ensured in the process of looking after the whole, we simply would not be able to ensure that the relationships can exist, because the parts themselves do not have well-being. So in the example that I gave before, where I talked about the human body, if the individual parts, the brain, the heart, the lungs, the liver, do not exist, then there is no whole. And therefore, there cannot be a relationship between the parts. So in the same way, that well-being of the parts is what some way we look at when we look at social and economic justice on the planet. We are looking at the well-being of the parts which make up the planet itself. And finally, to ensure that the relationships are healthy, we need to make sure that there is collaborative interaction which takes place in the relationships. And it's not one of exploitation, coercion, or abuse. And therefore, democracy, nonviolence, and peace are what ensure that the relationship is that which is symbiotic and collaborative. So these 4 aspects are extremely important in order to ensure that we can have planetary well-being. If we do not develop relationships which are based on these 4 pillars, then we would fail to ensure the well-being of the planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the way you see from your perspective is that we contribute so the question is, what are our contributions to planetary well-being? So from what I heard from you is that when we are expressing respect and care for the community of life is a way for us to be contributing to planetary well-being and so forth. Okay, thank you, Anupan. Brendan, what is your take on what is planetary well-being and what are our contributions to planetary well-being?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam, and thanks to the two previous speakers. I very much agree with both what they were saying and their contributions. So, you know, I see planetary well-being as the culmination and the emergent outcomes of all our ethically based actions, both individual and collective. And I think this idea is actually beautifully encapsulated in the Earth Charter in its concluding principle 16F, which reads, recognise that peace is the wholeness created by right relationships with oneself, other persons, other cultures, other life, Earth, and the larger whole of which all are a part. So planetary well-being, therefore, according to this Earth Charter principle, is the outcome of right relationships between ourselves with all these interrelated components. And of course, the right relationship with Earth here, of course, is critical to planetary well-being, as maintaining Earth's healthy environment and life support systems is a fundamental prerequisite for all life, ours and other species. So in terms of what are our contributions to planetary well-being, well, I think these arise in all aspects of our lives, from our lifestyle choices, for those who have the means to make such choices, from the actions of the organisations and businesses where we work or volunteer our time, through to whom we vote for at election time and the public policies and programs we do or don't support. So it's really the aggregate impact of everything everyone and every organisation in the human system does or chooses not to do, which results in this emergent property we can understand as planetary well-being. I think what's, to me, novel and essential about an Earth Charter understanding of planetary well-being is that it integrates maintaining Earth's planetary life support systems with an equal commitment to how we do this, i.e. to achieving just social and economic outcomes for people. So it's caring for both humans and nature holistically, which is the key to planetary well-being and which the Earth Charter's ethic aims to promote.
Great, thank you so much. So here comes to our fourth question. How could we, or how should we assess, evaluate, or measure our contributions to planetary well-being? Anupan, how could we assess? Is it assess, is it evaluate, measure our contributions to planetary well-being?
Well, I think, you know, almost everything we do every day, we like to assess and measure in order to be able to ensure that we accomplish what we want to accomplish. And therefore, if we want to ensure our well-being, we some way want to find out how are we contributing to this well-being. And of course, there are a zillion ways in which we can do this, just as there are a zillion ways in which we can try and find out whether we are free from COVID or not, and how much COVID is spreading, or what is the state of the war, or you know, what is the state of the economy. So there are a zillion ways to measure and look at what we do every day. Companies like to look at what revenues they have and what profits they are making. So without measuring, it's not possible for them to ensure that they would continue to be in business. So in the same way, it's important to be able to ensure that we can measure if we are contributing to the well-being of the planet, if we were to continue to ensure the well-being of the planet. In the absence of measuring it, we would just not pay attention to it. Just as for all time till now, we have really not been talking about the well-being of the planet. So how do you do this challenging task of trying to measure? So if one were to look at, and just give you an illustration with one aspect, I talked about 4 pillars that make up a relationship that contributes to the well-being of the planet. So I will give only one illustration just to say how we could possibly measure. So for instance, the difficult task of measuring respect and care, it's not easy to say how can we go and measure respect and how can we go and measure care. But I think intuitively, all of us know in our guts when we feel respected or when we feel disrespected. And there is some way that we actually measure it, because it's not respect that we are measuring, because we don't actually go into the heads of other people in order to see whether they are respecting the community of life or they are disrespecting. But we actually look at it from the actions of people in terms of how they show respect or how they show care. And so when we talk about respect, I think there can be no respect if we don't give attention. I think one of the things, important actions that we have that expresses respect is that we give attention. That means we give time. If we have no time, it's a sign of disrespect. It's important to ensure that we make time when we want to express respect for the other. Similarly, when we give space, we actually express care. So if we take away all the space from others, then we express the lack of care. So when we actually give space to other species, plants and animals, we are expressing care. And one of the very simple ways to look for what is the space that we give to other species, to plants and animals, is to look at what is the land that we leave for other species. So the Living Planet report actually indicates that there is less than 25% of the planet that has not been touched by human intervention. And I think this is really a sad statistic, because it reflects that we have occupied all the space for human activity. And we have considered, it's just like the brain saying that I'm going to occupy 75% of the body. It would be simply something which would stop our body, the well-being of our body. So in the same way, if humans decide that they're going to take up and occupy 75% of the planet or use it for their activities, then it obviously is going to change the relationship with the parts and not give other parts the space that they need in order to ensure well-being. So way to measure respect and care towards the other species and the relationship and the contribution we make to them is could be to simply look at what is the space that we leave for the other species. And similarly, one can go on and work out one kind of mechanism to measure the relationships that are essential for planetary well-being or for contributing to planetary well-being in a similar way.
Thank you. Kazu, what do you think about this? How can we, or how should we assess, evaluate our contributions to planetary well-being?
Thank you, Miriam. I would like to start with endorsing all what Sarah has just said. I would like to add just one point. Just imagine how we plays pillar number 4, and in particular putting emphasis on principle 16, peace and other elements, and address ourselves to the situation of Russia in the year 2022 and try to arrive at a certain points. And I think it is very important for us to try and measure contributions of a country to a global and planetary well-being, both positive elements and negative elements, and try and arrive at both aspects together as a contribution of a particular country to the planetary well-being at a certain point in history. And that is the only point I would like to add: the importance of both positive and negative contributions, and try and find a way to arrive at an overall situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Brendan, what is your take on this? It's a difficult question if you look at how we can actually do in terms of at the lens of a country's contributions to planetary well-being. How do you think we could or should assess or evaluate or measure the country's contributions to planetary well-being?
Yes, thanks, Miriam. And indeed, the measurement and the evaluation is difficult when it comes to ethical issues. But we can look at the suffering that people experience and the environmental harm that's done from unethical actions is real and measurable. So we can look at the ecological footprint of a country as it's like a negative indicator. We don't have a measure of good behaviour, we have a measure of bad behaviour. But I think, in addition to high level kind of systemic level indicators, I think there's also value in drilling down and using some of the principles in the Earth Charter, as these can provide, I think, some insightful assessments of kind of collective contributions at a national level to planetary well-being. And I think this is important because, for better or worse, we still live in a world where the main institutions of governance are sovereign states, and it's sovereign states that hold sovereign power over what goes on within those national borders. So, let's look at some of the principles relative to the general theme of ecological integrity. Principle 5B, it's very straightforward: establish and safeguard viable nature and biosphere reserves, including wildlands and marine areas, to protect Earth's life support systems, maintain biodiversity and preserve our natural heritage. So, a simple metric is the percentage of a given country that is being managed for conservation and biodiversity protection. Currently, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's a debate about what the post-Aichi targets will be for biodiversity, and one of them is this protected area target. What percentage of each country should be put under conservation management? At the moment, it's about 10%. People are arguing it should be 50%. Some people are arguing it should be 50%. Sorry, 30% to 50%. Anyway, this is a principle that the Earth Charter directly speaks to, and it speaks to what Anu Pam said before as well. How much room are we prepared to make for other species? a second principle, well, there's two other principles. It's interesting that the Earth Charter does not explicitly mention climate change. And this was kind of done intentionally, but there are two really important principles there that directly relate to climate change. One of them is 5F, principle 5F, manage the extraction and use of non-renewable resources such as mineral and fossil fuels in ways that minimise depletion and cause no serious environmental damage. And principle 7B, act with restraint and efficiency when using energy and rely increasingly on renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. So you put these two together and you actually have two principles which speak directly to the root cause of the climate change problem. And of course, there's a whole raft of commitments governments have made under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, including a global stocktake, which are, really directly measure how well they're giving effect to those two principles. And of course, whilst the Earth Charter is written as a linear document with the principles organised under four main themes, they're all interconnected. The Earth Charter has been nicely reformatted by some people as a circular mandala, just to try and stress that point. So we can also look at principle 5B here, which says, recognise and preserve the traditional knowledge and spiritual wisdom in all cultures that contributes to environmental protection and human well-being. So again, when we're looking at how we set up our conservation reserves and conservation managed areas, and when we look at how we can use renewable energy sources.
So Brendan, this last one you mentioned is which principle? 8B?
8B.
8B.
Yeah. Reserve and preserve the traditional knowledge and spiritual wisdom. So in establishing reserves, in the transition to clean energy sources, we need to do that in ways that gives effect to 8B. When we establish nature reserves, this has to recognise and respect traditional knowledge and spiritual wisdom, and do that in ways that it does that, which means respecting the customary owners of those forests and of those ecosystems. So I think these principles, provide a very clear link. They're written as ethical imperatives, but they directly relate to many of the policy process, international negotiations that are going on, which are aimed at the national level. They directly address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. Everyone's got a role to play, but as I mentioned at the beginning, they do need strong leadership by national governments, as it's national governments that hold the sovereign power over fossil fuel use and how ecosystems and used and managed. So that, in terms of national government, is one way. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So in that question I had embedded, we don't need to answer that now, but I have been thinking about these words, and also when we translate them, at least in Portuguese and Spanish, they mean different things in terms of assess, evaluate, and measure. So it's something for us to be thinking about whether we want to go to one road or another, and how much we can actually measure and how much we can just evaluate. Anyway, the country's contributions to planetary well-being. So I come to the last question. I'll start with Anupan. If you can be brief and share with us your thoughts on why do you think it's important for us to think about our contributions to planetary well-being? Anupan.
So I think, reflecting on 50 years after the Limits to Growth study, we are clearly on an overshoot path. And over 50 years, we have everything that we see, from the pandemic, the climate crisis, to the wars, I think, and to increased consumption and increased per capita consumption too. We really see that we will stay on the overshoot path because we have not really paid attention to the values that are important in order to move society away from an overshoot path. These values are the same values which decide the relationship we have with the others who share the planet with us and ensure that it ensure the well-being of the planet. So therefore, unless we are able to focus our attention to the values that are important for the relationships that we have with the others, unless we can ensure that we can in some way hold up that mirror to all of us in order to see if we are actually on the right track on the values that we have for our relationships with the others, we will not be able to ensure the well-being of the planet. So it's important to focus on the contributions or measuring or evaluating or assessing the well-being, the contributions towards the well-being of the planet, and helping our leadership to course correct and helping individuals, all the people, all of us to course correct and change the relationship that we have with the planet. Because unless that changes, we will not be in a way to ensure the well-being of the planet and the survival of the human species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It seems to me that it's an opportunity for us to look at the current crisis we have and to elevate or amplify our mindsets or our worldviews through the lens of planetary well-being, like in the midst of so many different interrelated crises, that we can kind of take a helicopter view and see it through the lens of planetary well-being and how all these crises are related. Because we would like to hear from you, why do you think it's important for us to think about, to put our attention into contributing to or not to planetary well-being?
Thank you, Miriam. To think about your question, the particular point in the Earth Charter, which I like very much, is the starting point of the last paragraph of the preamble, which says, we urgently need a shared vision of basic values to provide an ethical foundation for the emerging world community. And this sentence assumes that we still don't know what those values are. And therefore, the most important point is that in the world community, it's important for us to mobilize the process of looking for these values. And I think the Earth Charter itself, and also the exercise of indexation based on the Earth Charter would be a starting point of this exercise, the exercise of looking for these values. And I think it's extremely important to provide occasions for people who are struggling to look for these values to express themselves as much as possible in the world community. And I think perhaps, for instance, this particular webinar would be one of those occasions. And I think this particular sentence, which I think is the crucial point of the Earth Charter, would suggest that anybody who is engaged with the Earth Charter, like all of us, should feel it extremely important to listen to the views of as many people as possible, like the audience of this particular webinar. That's how I feel. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Brendan, you are an expert in climate change, in other things too, as a scientist. And when we have to look at climate change crisis, biodiversity crisis, now we have the agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Why do you think it's important for us to think or to put our attention in our contributions to planetary well-being? You're muted.
Thank you. There's a couple of points I'd like to make here. One, in relation to what's going on with the war, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also the wars that have been going on for some time in Africa and other parts of the world. Often they're called civil wars, but often they're primed and supported by other countries, of course. The Earth Charter has a whole, addressing this issue of war and violence is a very important part of the Earth Charter. So again, as an ecologist, when I talk about planetary well-being, I personally normally go to my scientific understanding of Earth's life support systems and issues to do with the climate crisis and also the biodiversity crisis, because we depend upon a lot of ecosystem service benefits from our natural ecosystems. But of course, the Earth Charter also talks about the importance of addressing war and violence. And I would just bring everyone's attention to Principle 16C, which is I think it's a very interesting one, a very nuanced principle. It says, demilitarize national security systems to the level of a non-provocative defense posture and convert military resources to peaceful purposes, including ecological restoration. I think it's a very powerful principle, which if it could be implemented would be utterly transformational in its consequence. It's also nuanced because it's not saying that countries should totally disarm. There was a lot of debate about this principle when the Earth Charter was being drafted, because many people thought, we should stick to the noble idea of total disarmament, but the kind of consensus was that it's a noble idea we should never dismiss, but it wouldn't actually provide any practical ethical guidance. On the other hand, calling for demilitarization to a point that enables self-defense, but without really the capacity to invade another country, it's kind of conceivably achievable, and if it would occur, would help bring about and be part of a profound change in global geopolitics. So to me, what's important in thinking about planetary health and why the Earth Charter is so helpful here is that it helps us think about it holistically. In addition to thinking about our ecological footprint, about decreasing our personal ecological footprint and our society or community's ecological footprint, that's an important contribution of planetary well-being because it's helping promoting a healthy and life-supporting environment for all and helping maintain our Earth's life support systems. But we also need to think about these other dimensions about, as Anupam said, about the respect we show for other species and also about addressing these other crises. Clearly, until we deal with war and, we need to deal with all these crises together. And we can't ignore how disruptive war and violence is to planetary well-being.
Okay, great. Thank you. I would like now to bring any comment or question that we may have from our dear participants. I saw we have some people from Japan, Australia, China, Costa Rica, elsewhere that are joining us. So thank you so much for being here with us. I would like to bring I think the Clem Campbell wrote a question in the chat box. I'm just going to read, if that's okay. The outcome of the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit included a major point, taking steps to go beyond GDP to assess the well-being of a country. It seems our governments do not go beyond GDP. Can we change this to measure well-being? So any one of you would have a comment to make to respond to Clem Campbell. And thank you, Clem, for being here and for your comment question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clem.
I'm happy to kick off. So thanks for that question, Clem, and good to see you again. We're only about 70 kilometres apart, I think. Not 1,000. So yeah, I mean, this is the crazy thing about GDP. It only measures the rate of the flow of money through an economy. So, you know, we have what some economists call the broken window theory of economics. Let's pay people to go around and smash shop windows, because that'll, in repairing the windows, we'll have more money flowing through the economy. So it doesn't measure anything about the costs or the benefits of avoided harm, and it ignores so much that's fundamental to our economic health. All the work done by homemakers is unaccounted for, and all the benefits we get from the ecosystem service benefits we get from our natural ecosystems, they're all unaccounted for. So it's absolutely crazy that it's such a dominant factor in our decision making. You know, especially when we know, you know, really well what its limitations are.
Takahashi here. I would like to mention, unfortunately, one failed case. In late 1960s, after a period of very rapid economic growth in Japan, we were forced to reflect on the concept of GDP very seriously, because we realized, although all of a sudden we became number 2 in GDP in the world community, the environmental cost was extremely enormous and dangerous. And for 2 or 3 years, top experts examined possible ways to measure the real wealth of a nation. And we came up with a certain measure. And we thought that it would be important to make it a global attempt to translate our activities into a certain set of indexation around national welfare. So we proposed to the OECD in 1972 to try and come up with an internationally agreed measurement of national welfare. The initial reaction of the industrialized countries were very positive. All of the countries welcomed this initiative from Japan. But after 2 or 3 years of examining how we arrive at concrete measurement and indexation, we came to a point that many of those points to be measured are highly related to individual cultures of nation states. And when we realized that the industrialized countries decided to abandon this attempt because it was almost impossible to arrive at an internationally agreed measurement. And that was half a century ago. Now, I think there have been many other attempts to try and arrive at an agreed measurement of national welfare. But internationally, I think it is important to remind ourselves that it started with a failure. Thank you.
Nupan, do you want to add?
Well, very, very briefly, I think every measure is a measurement of something, and it serves to help the person measuring it to tell something about what is being measured. To use that measure for something else, what it does not measure is usually a mistake. So I think to look at GDP as a measure of the well-being of a nation is obviously a huge mistake. It measures certain things about what is the investment made by individuals and governments in a country are served well by looking at GDP. But it can't be used for trying to attribute something that it does not measure. And I think that is the mistake that we have been doing across nations. And I think the whole idea of trying to come up with a way to talk about how can we measure the contributions we make to the well-being of the planet is a way to come up with a measure which talks about the well-being of the planet and not really about the well-being of an economy or the well-being of humans. So it's about the well-being of the planet. And therefore, it's your question is well-placed, Clem. I think it's basically measurements to look at the well-being of the planet would look at things which have not been looked at by other indicators which measure specific things and do not look at the well-being of the planet.
Great. Thank you, all of you. And so again, just an invitation for any comment or question that any one of you who are participating in this session, it's most welcome. You can either raise your hand or write in the chat box and we'll give you the floor. We have a few more minutes. So I would like to bring Nobuyuki Asai, who is joining us from Japan. He's saying, I may have missed some of today's conversation, but I feel the concept of global commons should be more broadly shared. Nowadays, all the things are being spent from capitalism perspective. The global society should pay more attention to it and start to discuss it through a new global structure. Earthchart is highly resonant with global commons. Is there any comment that any one of you would like to make on this?
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and thanks for bringing this concept up. I agree, it's really important here. And it's interesting what we've decided, or what the world community has decided is or is not part of the global commons. So The deep blue ocean is part of the global commons. The atmosphere is part of the global commons. Interestingly, forests are not, even though we can only meet global targets for climate change and biodiversity if we protect our natural forests. Natural forests are not considered part of the global commons. They're a sovereign resource. So I agree, one of the big impediments to planetary well-being, particularly from the biophysical side in terms of the life support systems, is this tension between what belongs to the global environmental commons and what belongs to the what is seen as a sovereign resource under sovereign state government control. And you know, I think one of the challenges we have, I think from a global governance point of view, is having a more holistic and inclusive view of what is within the global commons, and hence what is of common concern and requires international collaboration and cooperation.
Takahashi here, with regard to this very excellent point on global commons, I'd like to refer to the very good exercise which was pursued by UNDP in the middle of 1990s. It started with global commons and led to the question of global public goods. In this exercise, the physical aspects of the global public goods, such as environment and all sort of hardware part of the global public goods. And also it dealt with systems and institutions like the United Nations and so forth, and systems like the systems of all layers of international law and so forth. And this exercise has led to the publication of two excellent books in late 1990s. And this was the exercise which caught the eyes of the leaders of the world community for the first time, centered around the concept of global commons. Perhaps in recent period, based on this exercise, there must be further exercises of which I am not well aware, but starting point was in early 1990s. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Carol Inugai, I think is joining us from Japan. She wants to make a comment.
Thank you.
Brief,
yes.
Brief, right?
Yes, very brief. Yes, thank you for all this wonderful meeting here. I just want to flag the fact that well-being is becoming a focus in education more and more. I work in a school and a university in Japan, in Hiroshima, and well-being is part of our mission. And it's linked, we've linked it to the idea of student agency and values and systems thinking and spheres of influence. So, and through that to peace, that the idea of well-being and peace are somehow the same, can be equated or they can be connected. So it's really exciting to hear well-being being talked about in terms of governments and things as well. So we're very grassroots and with young people, but we think it'll make a difference, or we hope it'll make a difference.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
It's good to see that the school is already putting the notion of well-being at the heart or the mission of your school.
Yes. And practices to develop that. So we use something called C-learning, which has got contemplative practices in it, as well as neurobiology and science systems. So it's not just theoretical, it's actually about embodied transformational change. So we're very optimistic.
Thank you. The last one, I think, is a question that comes from YouTube. It's from Janie McCaffrey. Thank you, Janie, for joining us from YouTube. And she's wondering how intergenerational learning can help us save the wisdom of the past, but also open us to future learning so that we can better realize the goals of the Earth Charter. Anyone would like to make a comment or respond to this? It's an issue of the importance of intergenerational learning in rescuing the wisdom of the past and helping us move towards the future.
Yeah, I think this is, again, a really, really useful, helpful comment. And of course, traditional peoples, customary people, their knowledge was oral tradition. And so their knowledge management systems were based on intergenerational learning. The elders always passed the traditional knowledge on, the practical knowledge on to the younger generations. So, I think this is really important lessons for us here. One of the things, just to kind of bring it back to kind of Earth Day from the environmental perspective, of course, we're just seeing this ongoing decline in environmental quality, increasing destruction of ecosystems and just decreasing loss or increasing loss of biodiversity and species, increasing species extinctions. You know, our baseline that we, so when we make an assessment of how good or bad things are, it's to get some baseline. And it's kind of like the boiling frog syndrome, right? As things get worse, we forget how good they used to be. And we think, oh, it's not so bad compared to compared to our reference point. But often what we forget environmentally is that our reference point is actually a degraded system. So I think, this is where intergenerational knowledge can be really useful. If you talk to people, my mother's 97, right? She was born in the 1920s. She can tell me a lot about what the natural environment was like where she grew up, in the 1920s. It gives you a different understanding of what the baseline is. So I definitely agree we need to be thinking about this. And of course, there's a lot we can learn from the young, and I'm thinking here of the young climate activists and Greta Thunberg and these other young people who, again, are, because of their youth and their brains have not been locked into bad habits of thinking, are able to see the crises that confront us with fresh eyes, unbiased, and speak truthfully to them. So I think, there's a lot, there's the wisdom of the elders and there's the wisdom of the youth, and we need to be learning from both of them.
Thank you, Takahashi again. I think the essence of learning is the intergenerational exercise. History is always a rich resource of half-truth. We always try and learn something against the background of certain so-called facts, and the facts are provided by history, but these facts are always half-truth. And the other half of the truth has to be revealed from the new experiences of the new situations provided by the contemporary situation, where the new generation is the major stakeholder. And therefore, the exercise of learning is always an exercise of interaction between the young generation who are immersed in the new environment in terms of history with those who have revealed truth throughout the history, which the older generation has been learning. And I think this interaction between the new generation and old generation against the background of rich resources which is provided by history is the essence of the whole learning. And I think this applies to practically all aspects, and it is particularly important on the Earth Day when we are learning almost every day new aspects of history related to the challenges of environment. The old generation, like myself, has to learn from young generation, and in turn from the knowledge we accumulated from the history could be provided as a starting point of thinking from the half of the whole truth. Thank you.
Miriam, could I make a comment about generational change?
Yes, very succinct.
Yes,
Clem.
right.
Yes.
My generation, I'm in the 70s, I've got to say is different to my mother's generation and to my children's generation. We are basically probably the first generation that were able to look after our parents, right? And also now I'm helping our daughters and also our grandchildren. I've got to say with my grandmother, the two of them, my two grandfathers were dead when I was born. They were both grand old ladies. We gave them morning tea. We gave them afternoon tea. They did not take an active role in looking after us. So I'm just saying, I believe there's been a generational change, and there will be for our future generations. That my daughters had their children in their 30s. If they have their children in their 30s, they'll be possibly late 60, 70 before they become grandparents. So that will be another generational change. And I think this is something we've got to acknowledge in our relationship with the earth. Thank you.
Yeah, so Jenny, your comment on intergenerational learning actually reminded me about Daniel Quinn and his famous book, Ishmael. And in this book, Daniel Quinn actually talks about interspecies learning, because essentially he makes the teacher in his book a chimpanzee who is teaching humans about how to live on the planet. I think it's important to see that it's the ethical framework about how we relate to our planet and how we relate to each other that really decides whether we will have planetary well-being or not. And as I think everyone has pointed out, that planetary well-being is of utmost importance, especially in our times right now. And therefore, it is going to be even more important for all of us to focus on what are the ethical frameworks that we require in order to have the right relationships with each other and with the planet, in order to make sure that we continue or we contribute well to the well-being of the planet.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, our very special speakers, for taking the time to be here with us, for sharing your wisdom, your reflection. Brendan Maki, Anupan Sarap, and Kazoo Takahashi. I really want to express my gratitude for you for taking the time to share with us some of your thoughts and reflections on this very important theme. But also thank you everybody who is joining us here in Zoom or in YouTube, or who will continue to watch this, I think, in the recordings of this. Tomorrow we have 2 other sessions for us to celebrate Earth Day with our Spanish community and our Portuguese speaking community too. And we're going to be also looking at this, so that we're basically building or offering a space to reflect on the importance of planetary well-being, the importance for us to think about planetary well-being, and taking advantage of the fact that today is Earth Day, and hopefully every day is the day for us to think that Earth is our home, and how we can expand and deepen our consciousness in terms of how we are relating to one another and the large living world. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I invite you to take a look at the upcoming masterclasses that we are offering in different languages and also webinars. Thank you, and happy Earth Day, wherever you are. I think once Wangari Maathai used to say, after we have a lot of talk, let's go back home and dig a hole and plant a tree. That's what Wangari Maathai used to say after some long meetings. So thank you, everyone. Good night and good rest of the day for anyone, all of you. Bye-bye.